In the name of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, we want to give you thanks and praise for your goodness, your mercies upon our nation. We bless your holy name for all the things that you have done for us. Especially last week, the fire. It could have been worse, but by your grace and your mercies, you save us, O God. And therefore, Lord, we give you thanks. We pray for our leaders, O God, even as they come to deliberate issue concerning your nation. Father, we bring them into your hands. We pray for your wisdom, your knowledge, your understanding, O God. We pray that you guide, you lead them by your Holy Spirit. We pray especially for our speaker, who is going to lead this discussion. Father, we ask, O God, for wisdom. Guide him even as he guides this house. Lead him even as he leads, O God, that you grant your people the grace to put away all aside private interests, prejudices, and partial affection. The result of all our counsel may be to the glory of your holy name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, the honor and happiness of the Queen, the public will, peace and tranquility of St. Lucia, the uniting and knitting together of the heart of all persons and estate within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards one another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his light of countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Yes, Miss Cox. Good morning, honorable members. I have received excuses from the following members. Honorable Member for Castries North and Minister for Infrastructure, Ports, Energy and Labor. Honorable Member for Babono and Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries, Physical Planning, Natural Resources and Cooperatives. Honorable Member for Soufre Fonse Jacques and Minister in the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, Physical Planning, Natural Resources and Cooperatives. Honorable Member for Vieux North, and also Member for Castries South. I have also received word from the Honorable Member for Labrie. He's running late due to mechanical vehicular issues. Honorable members, let me extend sincere condolences to the family and friends of Miss Teresa Dixon of Denny Riviere Denry, who lost her life tragically in a vehicular accident on the Battle Hill on Wednesday, November 20th. My thoughts and prayers are with the family. I have since learned of the devastating fire that occurred in the iconic Ajuda building on Thursday, November 21st. I was unfortunately, well, fortunately, unfortunately, I was out of state at the time. I was informed of the hard work carried out by the Chief Fire Officer and his staff in ensuring that the fire was kept under control, and I would like to applaud them on the job well done. Also, special mention to the police officers for their assistance in controlling the public. Allow me also to express our regrets to the Ajoda family and the tenants and staff during this time of great loss. In commemoration of International Day of Persons with Disabilities, the National Council of and for Persons with Disabilities will be holding a short walk from the front of the National Insurance Corporation NIC building, waterfront, to the Constitution Park on Tuesday, 10th December. I have received an invitation to be part of this activity and also inviting all members to attend. Let me quote part of the invitation sent to me. It is with utmost, and I quote, "It is with utmost enthusiasm that the NCPD invites you to be part of this activity with us, especially the walk which will show solidarity with PWDs and will boost your commitment to the advancement of our sector. We wish to seek the support of your office in communicating this invitation to all members of Parliament and particularly independent senators, and efforts will be made by our council to contact government and opposition members of the House as well. Invitations to deliver brief remarks to express support for the advancement and full inclusion of PWDs in all facets of society and decision-making will be extended to the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Minister for Social Transformation, and the Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Brief statement will also be made by the President of the NCPD and a representative of Optimus International, unquote. I wish to extend congratulations to all our sportsmen and women who continue to do well and make our country proud. Special mention, of course, to Mr. Kimani Melius, who was named captain of the West Indies on the 19 cricket team for the ICC Cricket World Cup to be held in South Africa. Statements by ministers. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me join my voice in recognizing the incredible work that our firemen did in containing the fire, the level of professionalism that they conducted themselves in, and I know that it was a difficult task. I certainly want to join my voice with yours in recognizing their incredible efforts, and also to express our deepest sympathies to the families that were affected, and certainly we're hoping that they're going to be recovered quickly and to be assured of the government's support in being able to move forward. I also want to recognize the passing of a dear friend of mine, JP, who unfortunately passed away in my constituency. He used to be the former chairperson of my constituency branch, and my condolences go to his family and his friends on his passing. It's a gentleman that was a very bright individual, and I'm going to certainly miss his conversation and also his contribution to the development of this country.
Mr. Prime Minister, before you go into your statement, let me just complete my announcement. Special mention or special welcome to the students of the Arthur Lewis Community College. My apologies for not mentioning earlier, but I needed to get this out. Continue, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I had the opportunity of interacting with them for a very short time before the commencement of this House section, and if they don't mind, one of the things I shared with them is my continued concern with regards to the youth in our country and the seriousness in which we are dealing with climate change. Climate change is one of the most critical things confronting not only St. Lucia but globally, and I'm really trying to encourage our young people to get much more involved, much more informed, and to develop a position of their own on this issue. Even though you may find our policies wanting, it is your additional efforts of advocacy that would make a biggest difference. And I think that when we attended the UN meetings, and I want to applaud the Secretary General Guterres, who made sure that he invited a lot of young people to be able to attend the meetings. In fact, I had the opportunity of meeting a young woman who, at the age of 12, Mr. Speaker, decided to open up a business because she was concerned about the use of plastics in Bali. And so at the age of 12, what she did is she went to the hotels and to the restaurants and got them to donate their old sheets and their old towels and their old tablecloths. And she worked with her community in developing a organic dye to be able to dye these products into a common color, and then gave the material to single mothers in their community and had them sew it into bags, and then got the grocery stores and the different merchant offices to be able to buy those bags, and then in turn to pay the women that had done the work. And you know, one person can make a difference. And I want all of our young people to be empowered and to understand that the future is theirs more than anybody else, and that they must have a voice on this issue. Mr. Speaker, on November 19th, I was part of a delegation from the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, which participated in the roundtable discussion in the U.S. Congress to address matters of correspondent banking and de-risking. This meeting emanated from a decision of the CARICOM heads of government during our meeting here in St. Lucia early in July of this year, where we agreed on the need, as part of CARICOM's strategy, to engage key parties in the United States. This in light of the threat of our financial institutions losing critical relationships with the U.S. banks. CARICOM representatives included Prime Minister Gaston Brown of Antigua and Barbuda, who is lead head of government for financial services in CARICOM quasi-government, Stuart Young, Minister of National Security of Trinidad and Tobago, Dale Marshall, Minister of Legal Affairs and Attorney General of Barbados, other senior representatives and member states and CARICOM Secretary General Erwin LaRocque. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Chair of the Financial Services Committee of the United States, Congress hosted our Caribbean delegation. Significant, Mr. Speaker, was the attendance of other legislators and senior representatives of major U.S. banks, not least being Wells Fargo and the Bank of America. As CARICOM, we thought it vital that we engage in the U.S. government and key industry players on actions to address decisively the actual and potential challenges posed to our economies by the de-risking actions that have been taken by U.S. banks. In response to the U.S. government's strict legislation governing correspondent banking relations, CBRs, and the stiff penalties correspondent banks face for criminal infractions related to CBRs, correspondent banks have imposed increasingly stringent measures on domestic banks and in several cases have withdrawn correspondent banking services completely. To be more specific, Mr. Speaker, there was an amendment to the U.S. legislation after the financial crisis. And that amendment changed the penalties towards infractions as it pertained to this issue. Previously, the penalty was imposed on the size of the infraction. So if it was a $1,000 infraction, the penalty would be imposed based on it being $1,000. What followed, Mr. Speaker, was that the U.S. Congress changed that act and now imposes a fine on the size of the bank. So imagine if you are the Bank of America and now you have a small infraction taking place, but the penalty will be based on the fact that you're a $1 billion company. As a result of that action, Mr. Speaker, the banks then did an audit of our region and found many of our indigenous banks lacking the level of scrutiny or security or review that they required, and realized that in their weakness, it exposed them to being fined. And as a result of it, many of the correspondent banks decided to be able to withdraw from our country. Many St. Lucian citizens would not appreciate what this means. What this means, for instance, is that tourists who are coming to our country would not be able to use their credit card to go shopping. They would not be able to use their credit cards to be able to go to restaurants. But similarly, St. Lucians who are looking to travel, Mr. Speaker, would not be able to go online and book an airline ticket on JetBlue or American Airlines or Delta. Also, all the online shopping that we're currently doing and people are using their credit cards, we would be prohibited from being able to do that. Because without a correspondent bank, it means that we don't have anyone to be able to transfer our cash to the other merchants on a global basis. In response to the U.S. government's according to CARICOM reports, by mid-2018, between 25% and 75% of the 50 banks operating across CARICOM member states had reported either termination or restrictions on correspondent banking services. So in the case of Belize, Mr. Speaker, in fact, they lost all of their correspondent banks. And as a result of it, the government itself was having to send planes to Miami to pick up cash to be able to bring it to pay for their bills. Other negative consequences of de-risking have been an increase in operational cost, an extension in the processing time for international payments, as well as increased difficulty in account opening or securing bank services. So again, one of the fallouts that we've seen, the banks here reacting to that threat of loss of correspondent banking, they themselves have become much stricter in terms of how they are approving the opening of bank loans and also in terms of transfer of monies. And many solutions, in particular businesses, would have recognized how much more difficult it has become to be able to transfer money and also to open up any new accounts. Mr. Speaker, our domestic banks rely on correspondent banks to access international financial markets and overseas geographic regions. Without this intermediary service, numerous transactions that are routinely carried out on behalf of all of us, clients of the banks, would be impossible. Without correspondent banking relations, commonplace actions that ordinary people have grown to take for granted, such as online shopping, booking a flight or hotel room, a visitor using a credit card to purchase a meal from one or other local restaurants, sending or receiving remittances from loved ones overseas, private sector payment for goods and services, all of which are facilitated by correspondent banks, could not take place. Maritime transport companies, cruise lines, airline companies, international goods manufacturers, traders and retailers, from basic foodstuff to fine jewelry and luxury items, all trade across international borders and require the correspondent relations between banks in order to do so. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, without correspondent banking, Mr. Speaker, our economies could grind to a halt. I could not underscore enough the serious ripple effect that kind of economic decline would have for individual countries, the region, and the wider hemisphere. What then have we been doing in light of this? All CARICOM countries have been taking steps to enhance our anti-money laundering, counter-financing, or terrorism, which is AML CFT capability. Honorable members would recall that here in St. Lucia, we amended the Anti-Terrorism Act 2008 of 2019 in order to strengthen our ability to combat terrorist financing. Recommended amendments have been made to other laws such as the Money Laundering Prevention Act, the new legislation, the United Nations Sanctions Counter-Proliferation Financing Act, number 29 of 2019, designed to combat proliferation financing as enacted. We've also been working on capacity building, training our judiciary and enforcement agencies, as well as increasing the staff in these agencies. There is nevertheless considerable work left to be done if we are to halt and reverse the trend towards de-risking and ensure CBRs are reestablished. Mr. Speaker, our engagement with the various parties in Washington was one critical step in that direction. It was acknowledged that the loss of CBRs is also having a deleterious effect on institutions outside of the Caribbean, including the U.S. domestic banks. We agreed to work together to address the vexing matter of compliance. In that regard, the OECS proposal to establish a single compliance department was welcomed. We also agreed to reconsider the structure and the governance of our financial review units to ensure that they operate independently and are not viewed as arms of the executive, thence open to undue and improper influence. In improving our compliance mechanism, we were encouraged to consider the approaches set out in the Wolfsburg Principles and to embrace Know Your Customer, anti-money laundering, and counter-terrorist financing best practices policy. A great success, Mr. Speaker, was the Bank of America and Wells Fargo both reaffirmed their recommitment to remain in the region. This is particularly important because apart from facilitating transactions, banks like Wells Fargo also provide other services to regional banks, such as wealth management and loans. So, Mr. Speaker, it was a successful meeting, and I think that we all breathed a huge sigh of relief in hearing that we believe that the worst days are behind us in terms of the threat of losing our correspondent banks. But we are also reminded that there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. I will make this a document to the House.
Minister for Tourism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I take this opportunity to update the Honorable House on some major developments within the tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great privilege to announce that once again, St. Lucia continues to be among the fastest tourism growing destinations in the Caribbean region. The St. Lucia Tourism Authority, Mr. Speaker, reports that year-to-date October, St. Lucia's growth is at 7.5% in stayover arrivals. Mr. Speaker, this is well above our target of 6% projected for this year. Mr. Speaker, markets like the United States are up by 3.5%, Canada 17%, and the rest of the world are up by a whopping 28%. Mr. Speaker, the Caribbean market is abuzz with a brand caricaturing that is laser focused on welcoming regional visitors, whereby, as such, Mr. Speaker, the Caribbean market is up by 9%. Mr. Speaker, as we speak, Caricaturing is also undertaking a major 2020 roadshow in several islands this week, having just concluded major engagements in Grenada and Barbados. In the area of airlift, Mr. Speaker, we enter the peak winter period. We're pleased to announce some good news from North America. The U.S. market is reflecting a load factor of 91.2%. And despite higher fares, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian market is up by 88.7% load factor in all airlines coming from Canada. Mr. Speaker, we aim to leave no stone unturned in increasing our overall airlift position. Mr. Speaker, on December 21, the destination will welcome an inaugural flight from Chicago, Mr. Speaker, herein with no MRGs. Mr. Speaker, see that already, because of the tremendous work that the St. Lucia Tourism Authority has done, we see that the flight, Mr. Speaker, is arriving in St. Lucia on December 21 at full capacity. Mr. Speaker, our discussion with British Airways have yielded tremendous fruit, and when announced later this year, we will compensate for the expected fallout of Virgin Atlantic intended withdrawal from St. Lucia next summer. To complement this, we have instituted an unprecedented marketing campaign in the UK to ensure growth and sustainability in our second largest tourism market. Mr. Speaker, given this record-breaking success, it is imperative that we improve the level of inclusiveness for the participation of St. Lucian nationals in our economic mainstay. As such, the Ministry of Tourism is sparing no effort in completing the tourism satellite report by March 2020. Mr. Speaker, when completed, the report will give policymakers more comprehensive data from which to make more informed policy decisions. Mr. Speaker, I must add that this is necessary so that we can properly measure the true impact of tourism in its purest sense. When published, the tourism satellite account will measure the tourism industry's contribution to jobs, the tourism industry's contribution to foreign exchange, the procurement of local supplies, and other key economic indicators. It would also put St. Lucia way ahead, Mr. Speaker, of its competing Caribbean tourism destinations in the area of the procurement of statistics. Mr. Speaker, I want to also update the Honorable House on progress that is being made on village tourism, another windfall policy prescription by this government. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to inform the House that in the new year, work will commence on the ancillary waterfront to include a mini hotel, a restaurant and microbrew. We will also see a total overhaul of the fish fry facility and the complete upgrading of many private residencies on the ancillary waterfront. All done, Mr. Speaker, within the architectural character and the DNA of the community's mystique and charm. Mr. Speaker, works in Grosley is also expected to commence in the new year, as planning is at a very advanced stage for the northern town of Grosley. Mr. Speaker, I must note that this will add to the upgrading of Soufrière, which has already commissioned several projects in the southwest of St. Lucia. Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, has already adopted the policy that guides village tourism, and the Ministry of Tourism is at a very advanced stage of setting up an entity that would perform the functions of this major undertaking designed to empower St. Lucians to participate more meaningfully in tourism. Mr. Speaker, there's also good news in the maritime sector. As we place special emphasis on this subsector, I am pleased to report that St. Lucia is off to a bustling cruise season, Mr. Speaker. We have had 23 calls to the destination, 2 of which are inaugural calls, and we are looking forward to another inaugural call on December 13. Mr. Speaker, I am also pleased to report that the German Regatta Trophy is celebrating its 29th annual cup, and they chose St. Lucia as a destination of choice. Mr. Speaker, 13 vessels arrived here on Sunday, November 24th, while about 70 crew members who have not only docked here, but also enjoyed the islands in its splendor and contribute economically over a 4-day period. Mr. Speaker, we're also celebrating a historic transatlantic adventure underway with over 1,000 sailors from 53 nations, including 6 youth sailors from St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, the first fleet of over 200 vessels departed Las Palmas de Gran Canaria on Sunday, November 24, 2019, destined to cross over 2,700 miles to this beautiful island, where they will culminate the 34th edition of the Atlantic Rally for Cruisers at the IGY Rodney Bay Marina. This will also commemorate the 30th anniversary of ARC's finish in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, 30 years is a milestone worth celebrating, and the continued partnership with the World Cruising Club and various participants who come year after year is a reflection of the ethos of our people. Mr. Speaker, St. Lucians would have been enthused by the news of the government of St. Lucia and 2 of the world's largest cruise companies, Carnival Cruise Lines and Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines International, signing an MOU with the government of St. Lucia to build a cruise port in the south of Beaufort. Mr. Speaker, when completed, this will not only decentralize the tourism returns to other communities, but will add enormous economic benefits to the residents in the southern communities. Mr. Speaker, it's a very exciting time for tourism in St. Lucia, a time for growth, but also a time of inclusiveness, a time where we seek to optimize the enormous benefits of tourism to all of our peoples. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Papers to be laid. Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance.
Speaker, I beg to lay the following papers in my name. Statutory Instrument Number 146 of 2019, Legal Profession Eligibility, Andrew Ramjan Order. Statutory Instrument Number 149 of 2019, Value-Added Tax Resolution of Parliament to approve draft value-added tax amendments of Schedules 1 and 3 Order, and Statutory Instrument Number 153 of 2019, Excise Tax Amendment of Schedule 1, Number 15 Order.
Honorable Minister for Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I stand to lay the following papers standing in my name. Statutory Instrument Number 147 of 2019, Tourism Incentives, Fordo Estate Limited Order. Statutory Instrument Number 148 of 2019, Tourism Incentives, Caribbean Invest Capital Limited Revocation Order.
Honorable Minister for Commerce, Industry, Investment, Enterprise Development and Consumer Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay the following papers standing in my name. Statutory Instrument Number 151 of 2019, Standards, Appointment of Director of the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards, Validation Notice. Statutory Instrument Number 152 of 2019, Price Control Amendment Number 17, Order.
Honorable Minister for Youth and Sports.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to lay the following paper, standing in the name of the Minister of Equity, Social Justice, Empowerment and Local Government. Statutory Instrument Number 150, Burial and Cremation, Designation of Public Burial Ground, Notice.
Motions. Honorable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Whereas it is provided by Section 38(1) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, that the Minister of Finance may, by resolution of Parliament, borrow money from a bank or other financial institution by means of advances to an amount not exceeding in the aggregate the sum specified in the resolution to meet current requirements, and such resolution shall not have effect for any period exceeding 6 months. And whereas it is further provided by Section 38(2) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, that the power conferred on the Minister of Finance to borrow money by means of advances from a bank may be exercised by means of a fluctuating overdraft. And whereas it is further provided by Section 42(1) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, that all debt charges for which the government is liable shall be charged on and paid out of the consolidated fund. And whereas the Minister of Finance considers it necessary to borrow by means of advances from commercial banks sums not exceeding $55 million as follows. The Royal Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, $2.2 million. The Royal Bank of Canada, $2.8 million. First Caribbean International Bank, $4 million. Republic Bank, $6 million. First National Bank of St. Lucia, $2.5 million. And the Bank of St. Lucia, $37.5 million. Be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister of Finance to borrow by means of advances sums not exceeding $55 million from commercial banks for a period of 6 months from the date hereof, which sum shall be charged and paid out of the consolidated fund. The purpose of the resolution is to authorize the Minister of Finance to borrow money from a bank or other financial institution by means of advances to an amount not exceeding the aggregate sum of $55 million for a period not exceeding 6 months to facilitate the timely settlement of government salaries and other operating expenses. Section 38(1) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, provides that the Minister for Finance may, by resolution of Parliament, borrow money from a bank or other financial institution by means of advances to an amount not exceeding in the aggregate the sum specified in the resolution to meet current requirements, and as such, resolution does not have effect for any period exceeding 6 months. Further, it is provided by Section 38(2) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, that the power conferred on the Minister of Finance to borrow money by means of advances from a bank may be excised by means of fluctuating overdraft. By Section 42(1) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, all debt charges for which the government is liable shall be charged on and paid out of the consolidated fund. By resolution of Parliament published as Statutory Instrument Number 93 of 2019, Parliament authorized the Minister for Finance to borrow sums not exceeding $55 million outstanding at any one time by means of a fluctuating overdraft from specified commercial banks. However, that statutory instrument will become spent and no longer effective on the 24th of December 2019. It is therefore necessary to seek Parliament approval to borrow by means of advances from commercial banks sums not exceeding $55 million from the following commercial banks: the Royal Bank of Trinidad, $2.2 million, the Royal Bank of Canada, $2.8 million, the First Caribbean International Bank, $4 million, Republic Bank, formerly the Bank of Nova Scotia, $6 million, First National Bank of St. Lucia Limited, $2.5 million, Bank of St. Lucia, $37.5 million. Parliament must authorize the Minister for Finance to borrow by means of advances the sum of $55 million from the commercial banks identified in the resolution for a further 6 months. Please be noted, Mr. Speaker, that we have not increased the amount of that allocation.
Honourable members, the question is that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow by means of advances sums not exceeding $55 million from commercial banks for a period of 6 months from the date hereof, which sum shall be charged on and paid out of the consolidated fund. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Whereas it is provided by Section 39(1) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, that the Minister for Finance may, by resolution of Parliament, borrow money from a bank or other financial institution for a capital expenditure of government. And whereas it is further provided by Section 42(1) of the Finance Administration Act, Cap 1501, that there shall be charged upon and paid out of the consolidated fund debt charges for which the government is liable. And whereas the Minister of Finance considers it necessary to borrow $6 million by way of credit in this resolution referred to as the credit from the International Development Association for capital expenditure for the OECS Regional Health project, and whereas the maximum commitment charge rate payable on the underdrawn finance balance is 0.5% per annum, and whereas the service charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of the sum of 0.75% per annum plus the basis adjustment and 0.75% per annum. And whereas an interest charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance is equal to the greater of the sum of and 1/4 per annum plus the basis adjustment and 0% per annum. And whereas the principal amount of the credit is repayable on each of the 15th day of February and the 15th day of August, commencing on the 15th day of August of 2029 to including the 15th day of February 2039 at a rate of 1%, and commencing on the 15th day of August 2039 to and including the 15th day of February 2059 at the rate of 2%. Be it resolved that Parliament authorizes the Minister of Finance to borrow $6 million US by way of credit, in this resolution referred to as the credit, from the International Development Association for capital expenditure for the OECS Regional Health Project. The maximum commitment charge rate payable on the unwithdrawn financing balance is 0.5% per annum. A service charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of 1, the sum of 0.75% per annum plus the basis adjustment, and 2, 0.75% per annum. An interest charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of 1, the sum of 1.25% per annum plus the basis adjustment, and 2, 0% per annum. The principal amount of the credit is repayable on each the 15th day of February, 15th day of August. 1, commencing on the 15th day of August 2029, and including the 15th day of February 2039 at a rate of 1%. And 2, commencing on the 15th day of August 2039, including the 15th day of February 2059 at a rate of 2%. Mr. Speaker, the resolution before Parliament is to seek approval for the Government of St. Lucia to borrow from IDA Credit a loan of $6 million for the OECS Regional Health Project. The objective of this project is to respond to demand for financial support for the preparedness for public health emergencies expressed by Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It is expected to enhance the country's capacity to adapt and to mitigate against the impacts of climate change across the OECS region. The project intends to build resilience and mitigate cross-border transmission of disease outbreaks and disruptions in the aftermath of extreme weather events caused by impacts of climate change. Therefore, a regional approach is warranted whereby investments in preparedness are harmonized at the country level and complemented at the regional level. The project consists of 4 components and will receive funding allocation as the following national level. Component 1, improved health facilities and laboratory capacity, allocation of $4.4 million US. This component will support the refurbishment and equipping of selected health facilities to ensure continuity of care and improve laboratory infrastructure and equipment with correspondent training. Component 2, strengthening of public health surveillance and emergency management, allocation of $1.3 million US. This component seeks to improve the completeness and quality of the reporting chain for surveillance activities from the national to regional level, including improvements in interoperability and the development of a regional dashboard to monitor trends. Component 3, institutional capacity building project management and coordination, an allocation of $470,000 US. This component will support the critical building blocks for strong implementation and coordination required for implementing a regional project. It will include technical assistance for contract management, procurement, financial management, environmental and social safeguards, construction supervision, monitoring and evaluation, and project audits. Component 4, Contingent Emergency Response Component, CERC. This zero-cost component aims to provide intermediate surge funding in the event of a public health emergency, such as a disease outbreak. The CERC is only triggered in the case of a public health emergency and when certain actions are agreed by the government and the World Bank are met. Despite the limited fiscal space for public investment in health emergencies across the region, there is a need for building ex-ante resilience to climate change, natural disasters, and public health emergencies. The project is relevant and consistent in mitigating and or preventing public health risk and the economic consequences associated with infectious diseases. Project beneficiaries are an estimated 1.5 million population covering the entire OECS region, given the public goods nature of public health, emergency and preparedness and response. While 4 of the 7 full member countries are participating in the project, country-level activities are expected to yield positive regional spillovers. And the investments made through the project are expected to improve the health security in the region. In St. Lucia, the regional project will be implemented through the established Project Implementation Unit, PIU, within the Ministry of Health and Wellness, which is currently implementing the 2018 approved Health System Strengthening Project. Capacity building and other support will also be provided by the National Project Coordination Unit, PCU. All debts issued by the government to St. Lucia become a charge on the consolidated fund. The loan is repayable in 40 years, including a grace period of 10 years. The maximum commitment charge rate payable on the unwithdrawn financing balance shall be 0.5% per annum. The service charge is the greater of A, the sum of 3/4 of 1% per annum plus a basis adjustment to the service charge, and B, 3/4 to 1% per annum on the withdrawn credit. Interest charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of the sum of 1.25% per annum plus the basis adjustment, and B, 0% per annum. The payment dates are February 15th and August 15th in each respective year. Mr. Speaker, I submit this resolution for the consideration of this Parliament.
Honourable members, the question is that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow US $6 million by way of credit, in this resolution referred to as the credit from the International Development Association for capital expenditure for the OECS Regional Health project. And be it further resolved that A, the maximum commitment charge rate payable on the unwithdrawn financing balance is 0.5% per annum. B, a service charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to and greater of 1, the sum of 3/4 of 1% per annum plus the basis adjustment, and 2, 3/4 of 1% per annum. C, an interest charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of 1, the sum of 1.25% per annum plus the basis adjustment, and 2, 0% per annum. And D, the principal amount of the credit is repayable on each 15th day of February and 15th day of August 1, commencing on the 15th day of August 2029, 2, and including the 15th day of February 2049 at the rate of 1%, and 2, commencing on the 15th day of August 2049, 2, and including the 15th day of February 2059 at the rate of 2%. Member for Denrenoff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, mine is more of an inquiry than a contribution. But before I speak to the motion that is before us, I want to profit the opportunity, like you, to place on the record my admiration for Kimani Melius. And I want to take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of all the constituents of Denry North and all the cricket-loving and sports-loving people of this country, to express congratulations to Kimani for having been chosen as the captain of the West Indies youth team to lead the regional team at the Youth World Cup starting on the 17th of January. Now, I notice, Mr. Speaker, that the tournament concludes on the 9th of February, and I think a homecoming for Kimani with trophy in hand would be a perfect gift on the eve of Independence 41. Like you, Mr. Speaker, I want to express condolences to a constituent who was also a neighbor who lived less than 200 yards from my house in the person of Teresa Dixon, who succumbed last week, Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, in a vehicular accident. Mr. Speaker, the OECS Regional Health Project, I think, is an initiative that I support, and I think I can say so on behalf of my colleagues on this side of the House. Yesterday, I went in search of details of this particular project, and there was not much forthcoming until I visited the World Bank site. This project
from what I saw, Mr. Speaker, was approved on the 29th of August earlier this year. And the project aims to improve resilience of health facilities, basically health centers, and I guess to a certain extent, the hospitals. And I think this is a welcome initiative, given the ferocity with which hurricanes are battering the region nowadays. But Mr. Speaker, what I was not able to understand after having gone through the World Bank site was whether the money that we are borrowing is a requirement at the regional level where that money must be deposited into a fund to execute the project regionally, or whether that amount reflects the assessments that would have been made in relation to our existing health facilities, and that the $6 million, Mr. Speaker, would actually be spent based on the needs of the various health facilities throughout the different constituencies in this country. I was not able to come to an understanding where that was concerned, Mr. Speaker, and I think this is something that the Prime Minister or somebody on the other side would be willing to explain, just to help me clarify that particular aspect. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a welcome initiative, and quite apart from looking to strengthen the infrastructure as it relates to health facilities, but there are other components, as detailed by the Prime Minister, that can only augur well for us at the sub-regional level. Notwithstanding, it speaks to the OECS project. I noticed in the first phase, Mr. Speaker, only the Windward Islands, namely St. Lucia, Dominica, Grenada, and Dominica, were cited on the website. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Vieux-Fort South.
Mr. Speaker, I join my colleague in welcoming the project. But I note that the final verdict on that project has to be given after the explanations offered by the member for Mico South. There are two aspects, I think, Mr. Speaker, that merits comments, and one touches tangentially on the contribution of my colleague from Denry North. Mr. Speaker, from time to time in this House, we are presented with motions emanating initially, of course, from regional institutions, in this case the OECS, to lend our support to financial measures. In other words, we join with other governments in the region to guarantee debts that would be managed by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. I have in the past cautioned about this increasing tendency for international organizations to go through regional organizations for projects of one kind or another. But I guess at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it's a matter of judgment which type of projects better suit a regional approach. The problem, however, is information. We got the motion, and obviously all that we have in the motion are essentially the financial underpinnings of the motion. The amount of money, what rates of interest, etc. Outside of that, there is nothing that really explains what the project is about, except, of course, when the member from Mico South provided the explanation to the House. Now, I have always had an issue with the accountability of regional organizations when they use the powers of parliaments to seek authority to engage in activities of one kind or another. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the OECS, after consultation with regional governments, including the government of St. Lucia, may want to rethink its approach on these matters, and whenever they are approaching parliaments for their endorsements for loans of one kind or another. And I say this because, Mr. Speaker, It's nothing unusual. We have had that kind of approach in the past, but increasingly it becomes clearer that there is need for information on these matters. And perhaps what can be done in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, is that the OECS, through the Office of the Prime Minister, supply all members of Parliament with basic information of what it is they're asking Parliament to do, so that they don't really just send the information on to opposition parliamentarians or members on the other side, but they circulate it to everybody, and this, of course, will undoubtedly help the explanations. And in any event, should there be any questions that will be posed to the person who is bringing the motion, one would be better prepared to do this. I get a sense that the OECS is becoming more and more remote from the peoples of the region, from the parliaments of the region, and this is really becoming a very intriguing issue. But that apart, Mr. Speaker, I raise again the matter of accountability of the OECS organization, as well as others too, for projects they have been given to manage. We never seem to know what happens to these projects. You hear announcements from time to time. I mean, I know, for example, about the pedestrianization of the project in respect of the boulevard. I mean, that has been a project which was negotiated during the tenure of the former government, and it's been with them for quite some time. So you hear the announcements, but, Mr. Speaker, you never hear about the results of the implementation of the project. And perhaps some consideration could be given to persuading the Secretariat, or what they call themselves now, there's the Commission, which is an unusual term, but never mind, to persuade the Commission to publish information on how they are implementing these projects and the outcome of these projects. Normally, Mr. Speaker, Parliament never makes a big issue of projects managed by regional organizations. We never do. I think the tendency has always been to support the government of the day in these projects, and I don't think that should change at all. Simply what I'm saying is that there has to be a far greater level of accountability from these regional organizations regarding the implementation of these projects. But all in all, this is a good project, and I have no difficulty in joining my colleague and welcoming this project for the region. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, with regards to responding to the questions by members on the opposite side, that the $6 million is allocated to St. Lucia. That's the portion that's being spent in St. Lucia. And as indicated in my notes, that it's going to be managed by the project management unit at the Ministry of Health. So there is accountability and transparency in terms of making sure that this project is taking place. As it pertains to what the former Prime Minister, his observations with regards to OECS, they are different types of projects. So they are projects in which they are conducted under and executed by the OECS, and this is why each of the governments have appointed ambassadors to the OECS, and rightfully so, indicated by the former Prime Minister that they're called commissioners. And so therefore, each country has the opportunity of making sure that the work program and the execution of that work program is done. So there are regular meetings of the commissioners that act as a board of directors. As the member from Beaufort South would have known, that like in many organizations, there has been a tussle between the Secretariat and the Commission in terms of what latitude the commissioners have and who are they really accountable to. And sometimes the Secretariat believes that they have the direct line to the Prime Ministers, and we have to remind them that their work program and their budgets are approved by the commissioners. Clearly the Prime Ministers are policy makers, but the overall administration and oversight and the execution of the work program by the OECS is done by those commissioners. So in this particular project, it's a bit different in that we have applied collectively to the World Bank to access regional funds. So most of these international organizations have an allocation of funds to you on a national basis, and then there's also funds made available on a regional basis. And so there are times when we pool ourselves together. CARSIP is a recent one with education, in which several of the countries have come together with one theme, but that the funds are distributed on a national basis, but it's managed by the IDA funds as a regional project. So I just want to say that their comments are well taken, and that we agree with them in many instances, but hopefully in this particular project, that members on the other side will be satisfied that given that we're asking for the guarantee to be given from St. Lucia, the $6 million is what is being implemented here, and as indicated in my notes, that that project is going to be overseen by the planning unit of the Ministry of Health. And it will be benefiting all of the healthcare centers in St. Lucia in terms of trying to be able to improve the standards of all of our healthcare centers.
Honourable members, the question is that Parliament authorizes the Minister for Finance to borrow US $6 million by way of credit, in this resolution referred to as the credit, from the International Development Association for capital expenditure for the OECS Regional Health project. Be it further resolved that A, the maximum commitment charge rate payable on the unwithdrawn financing balance is half of 1% per annum. B, a service charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of 1, the sum of 3/4 of 1% per annum, plus the basis adjustment, and 2, 3/4 of 1% per annum. C, an interest charge is payable on the withdrawn credit balance that is equal to the greater of 1, the sum of 1.25% per annum, plus the basis adjustment, and 2, 0% per annum. And D, the principal amount of the credit is repayable on each 15th day of February and 15th day of August, 1, commencing on the 15th day of August 2029, 2, and including the 15th day of February 2049 at the rate of 1% per annum, and 2, commencing on the 15th day of August 2049, 2, and including the 15th day of February 2059 at the rate of 2%, sorry. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bills. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the first reading of a bill shortly entitled Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment.
Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the suspension of Standing Order number 48-2 to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honourable members, the question is that Standing Order number 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Honourable Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Leave is granted. Proceed, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the second reading of a bill shortly entitled Millennium Heights Complex Amendment. In January of 2018, the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Act number 1 of 2015, the Act, came into force and established the Millennium Heights Medical Complex, which consists collectively of the Owen King European Union Hospital, the National Mental Wellness Center, and the Turning Point Rehabilitation Center. The Act provides for the establishment of a board which is responsible for the overall management and administration of the medical complex. including employment of staff. Consequently, any person seeking employment at the medical complex would no longer make that application through the public service of St. Lucia, but through the administrative apparatus of the medical complex, and be subjected to the conditions of the employment therein. Recognizing that there may be also instances where personnel may have to be retained or transitioned from the public service to take up duty at the medical complex, provision was also made for the transfer or secondment of a public officer to the service of the board and the preservation of that officer's pension rights. However, based on the Pensions Act Cap 15.26, the use of the word transfer considers the movement of a public officer from one department or ministry to another within the public service of St. Lucia. And the movement of a public officer from the public service of St. Lucia to the public service under a government of another territory listed in the Pensions Regulations Cap 15.26. A transfer under the Pensions Act Cap 15.26 does not appear to encompass a movement such as that envisaged in the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Act. Additionally, the Act only makes general reference to who has the power to second a public officer to the service of the board of the Millennium Heights Medical Complex. In order to cure the inconsistency and ambiguity which arises from the aforementioned, the bill therefore seeks to amend the Act by firstly deleting any reference to the transfer of a public officer to a Millennium Heights Medical Complex, and to only make reference to the secondment of a public officer. Secondly, the bill seeks to make clear which entity has the power to second a public officer to the service of the board of the Millennium Heights Medical Complex, namely the Public Service Commission, the Teaching Service Commission, or the Judicial and Legal Services Commission, as the case may be. So, Mr. Speaker, the attempt of this bill is to basically remedy a vexing problem in order to be able to give the staff who are currently employed within the civil service the confidence that when they are seconded to the Millennium Heights, that their pensions will be intact, and that therefore what they have come to be accustomed to in being seconded, that would still stay in. So this is a remedy, and we always make attempts to write bills the best way possible. I know we have many debates in this House as to the accuracy and the ability of when we write these bills, but we always don't get it right. But the good thing is that at some point the problem arises, and we also always have the recourse of coming back to the House to be able to amend these things, because I know that these things were always done with the best interest of everybody in mind. Thank you.
Honourable members, the question is that the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment Bill be read a second time. Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I got the order paper and a copy of the amendment on Thursday or Friday, it looked very simple to me. It looked very simple to me, but I had to look deeper to find out what was there, knowing the government has a tendency sometimes to want to kill a rat, they burn a house. I wanted to find out what was, when they want to kill a rat, they burn a house. I wanted to find out what really was there. And I found out a few things, Mr. Speaker. I found out for one, that a civil servant cannot be transferred from the government service to the private sector. You have to be seconded. A civil servant, I say it again, cannot be transferred or cannot be taken away, transferred from the civil service to the private sector. They have to be seconded. That's the first thing I found out. So, ask a question. Is it because the hospital is going to be privatized? Just a question. Because a civil servant cannot come from us, like supposing there is a doctor or a nurse, etc. You cannot transfer him or her from the hospital to the private sector. You have to second them. First question. The second question I want to ask, Mr. Speaker, is what will happen to the ward maids and the porters and the people who are not establishment workers? My information tells me that non-established workers cannot be either seconded or transferred if you're non-established. So if you are a maid, or you are porter, or you are somebody in that category of work, you can neither be transferred nor seconded. So you are at the mercy of the political directorate. And by the way, I understand recruitment has already started to take place. So you find yourself, the ward maids and the porters in the hospital will now be at the mercy of the government. I stand corrected if I have to be. I repeat, non-established workers can neither be seconded nor transferred. Thirdly, and there was another question. When the workers are seconded from one entity to another, the pension rights are preserved. I understand that, but is the security of tenure also guaranteed? And thirdly, I want to ask a question as to what is the state of the transitioning of the hospital? Because I know for a fact that this government has employed an Indian consultancy firm. This government has contracted an Indian consultancy firm, and I can make it a document house if you want. The board of directors of the Millennium Heights Medical Complex has contracted the services of consultants. And the consultants are Narayana, Narayana, Hrudayalaya Limited of India, to assist with the transitioning from the Victoria Hospital to the Owen King European Union. The consultancy is with respect to the provision of advisory and technical services to the board directors or the Millennium Heights Medical Complex with the aim of completing the transition of services from Victoria Hospital to the Owen King European Hospital. The first step of the consultancy will involve...
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, please identify the document that you're reading from. Just identify the document.
The document is a memo to the heads of departments and the staff of the Department of Wellness from the Permanent Secretary, and it's a consultancy that the government has contracted. It's not a contract, the government is in the process of tendering. They have awarded the contract to a firm in India. And I will see if it's a firm in India, it's an Indian consultancy firm to provide consulting services. And I note that local people had already been contracted to deal with the transitioning of Victoria Hospital. Was that wrong? Was the transition of Victoria Hospital, was the process not correct? Led by Dr. Stephen King, a commissioning board had already been formed. But this government is contracting another set of people, foreigners, another set of foreigners. And I note the advice by the World Bank that you must be careful in the employment of consultants who are not from the country. So you need to get another set of consultants. I suspect they are from India because it is said of India. These people understand better the transitioning of Victoria Hospital
to the OKU than local consultants led by Dr. Stephen King. That is the respect we have for local consultants, and that's the respect we have for local people. The local people, the transitioning that was done, the work that was done by the local consultants is not adequate. But I suspect, again, the point I made, that the burning a house to kill a rat, that is the first step. The first step. Because all in a sudden, the privatization of the hospital has disappeared. So the Cayman Islands are no longer there. Health City Cayman is no longer there. All in a sudden, we were told at some point that the hospital can't run on its own. We have no money to run it. We need to make it a tourist-based hospital. Now that has disappeared, and now we have, first of all, we are preparing the ground.
Leader of the opposition, don't take this debate beyond what it ought to be this morning. I'm asking you to just note what we are debating. Because if I allow you to go beyond, I will have to balance it by allowing the government side to go beyond. Let's keep this debate as tight and neat as possible, and let's move on. Continue, sir.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note your guidance, and I will follow. But I just want to make the point, Mr. Speaker, that this amendment is preparing the ground to remove transferring and preparing the ground for secondment. So if the hospital becomes a private entity, it's going to be easier or easy to take civil servants, doctors, nurses, and second them to the new entity instead of transferring them, as is the case if the hospital was a public sector hospital. Regarding the pension rights, I have no problems with that. And I further want to say that non-established workers cannot be seconded or transferred. So I want to find out what will be the plight of the non-established workers, knowing the government likes to make people cry. And I would like to find out what is the plight of these porters and these non-established workers who presently work at the hospital. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Denridov.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I suspect one of my worst fears is being realized in the Parliament this morning, and notwithstanding your guidance to the Leader of the Opposition, I want to state that it is very difficult to discuss the proposed amendment to the legislation without looking at the OKU hospital in its totality. Mr. Speaker, like the Leader of the Opposition, I believe that the proposed amendment to the legislation is paving the way for the government to give the OKU to foreign interest for management. And the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, was correct when he said that you cannot transfer a public servant to a private entity, but you can second if you so desire. And if the OKU in its operation were to remain as a public entity, there would have been no need to second staff from existing health facilities to the OKU. A transfer, from my understanding, would have sufficed. So, Mr. Speaker, what we are doing here this morning is to legitimize and pave the way, as I said, for the hospital to be given to foreign interest for management. But what is interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that we are prepared to give a hospital to a foreign entity for management, but the same government is not prepared to allow a foreign interest to preside over the operations of the airport. Mr. Speaker, healthcare is a very, very serious issue in this country. And we have a healthcare crisis on our hands. And the situation that confronts the average St. Lucian, Mr. Speaker,
just keep the voice.
and the situation that confronts the average St. Lucian, Mr. Speaker, affects people from both sides of the political divide. Mr. Speaker, only day before yesterday, a constituent of mine who was at the Victoria Hospital, after having spent 3 nights there on a chair, was relieved to have been discharged to get bed rest at home. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do not care where in St. Lucia he resides. I have no interest in which party he supports. This is an indictment on us as a country. And the sooner we can, Mr. Speaker, address the healthcare situation or crisis in the country, the better it will be for all of us. The OKEU Hospital, Mr. Speaker, came into being after many years of trying to rehabilitate and ameliorate and improve the situation and the conditions at the Victoria Hospital. I remember in the late 80s as a school child, Mr. Speaker, I had to sacrifice my break money to make a contribution to help with the rehabilitation of Victoria Hospital. And Mr. Speaker, I was relieved when I learned that a brand new hospital was being given to St. Lucia by the European Union. And this is the largest infrastructure project that the European Union has embarked on in the Eastern Caribbean, to provide us with a state-of-the-art hospital, so that the hundreds of St. Lucians who cross the channel every year to seek medical assistance in Martinique, that would become a thing of the past. The hospital, Mr. Speaker, was constructed, and for a number of years now, St. Lucians have not been able to benefit from that hospital. And so the government has decided, in its endeavor to commission the hospital, it must make changes to the existing legislation. Mr. Speaker, as I said in my preamble, I believe that this is paving the way for the government to put the hospital in private hands. And whereas the government can cite efficiency and cost savings, Mr. Speaker, with such an approach, we have to spare a thought for the average St. Lucian who will not be able to access care in a private arrangement. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, the inability of St. Lucians to meet affordable health care is reflected in the astronomical amounts that people are owing to St. Jude and Victoria Hospital. My understanding of privatization, Mr. Speaker, is that when an entity is privatized, it is placed in the hands of average people or private people to manage and to operate for purposes of profit. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, when it is the government running that entity, whereas you want to break even as much as possible, there are going to be situations when people come to the doors of the hospital and they will not be able to pay for those services. To what extent have we taken that into consideration with such a move, Mr. Speaker? To what extent have we considered whether people will be able to meet whatever price structures are set at the hospital? And these are very serious questions that we must answer. So, Mr. Speaker, whether you decide to change the legislation to give the government or the different services commission the authority or the power to seek on as opposed to transfer, it boils down to one simple thing, in my opinion, and that is the proposed changes to the legislation is preparing the hospital, Mr. Speaker, to be run and to be operated by private interest. And when that happens, Mr. Speaker, my question remains, who is going to advocate on the part of those persons who are not able to meet the cost of health care when, Mr. Speaker, the hospital is being operated by a private entity? They go to Victoria Hospital and you're told upon arrival there that you must pay X amount to receive X service. And Mr. Speaker, even when they're not able to pay, people still get served. And what we see is that the death at Victoria Hospital as it relates to patients who come there seeking assistance continues to rise. But the government has a responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to not turn people away even if they are not able to meet the cost of the services that they're seeking. How am I going to be assured that if the hospital is in private hands, that the same persons who are not able to afford in a public setting will be able to meet the cost of their health care? So, Mr. Speaker, I believe that this is something that we have to reconsider if, Mr. Speaker, I am correct that the proposed amendment to the legislation is preparing the hospital for takeover by a private entity. In every country, big or small, and more so in small island developing states, the government has a responsibility to safeguard the interest of the marginalized and the average people in society when it comes to the provision of essential services. Whether we like it or not, there are people from each and every one of our constituencies who cannot make ends meet at the end of the day. To what extent have they been considered, Mr. Speaker, with this proposed change to the amendment? Mr. Speaker, I welcome the explanations, I welcome the answers, and let me say that any attempt, whether it's subtly or in an open way, to privatize the OKE hospital, that will not find favor with the parliamentary rep for Denry North, and I'm sure I can say by extension, members on this side of the House. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Castries Central.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to lend my support to the adoption of this bill by this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, the government of the United Workers' Party was elected into office on the promise of building a new St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, that entails building a new culture with respect to many of our sectors and the way we do things. Building a new culture in health, Mr. Speaker. This is what we're talking about. Our health services need complete reform and overhaul. And I don't think that there is any single St. Lucian who does not believe it, including members of the opposition. To build this new culture in health, Mr. Speaker, we must stop playing politics with health. We must come clean. We must come straight. We must recognize that at the end of the day, what we all should want for St. Lucia is what every individual St. Lucian wants, needs, and has a right to. That is the best health care which they can afford. That's the bottom line. The bottom line is that as a government, and when I say government, I'm talking about all of us in this room. What we should want for every St. Lucian is the best health care at a price that people can afford. That's the bottom line. And all the time we spend here going back and forth, it is about that. When I sit in my constituency office, on the days when I do my surgery at the constituency office, the number of persons who come in requesting assistance just to visit a doctor, just to get an x-ray done, and we find ourselves continuously having to assist St. Lucians just to make a doctor's visit. And this is what we are trying to address, ensuring that healthcare is provided, world-class healthcare, which St. Lucians can access. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do not understand what the problem the opposition has with consultancies. I don't understand it. We bring in consultants for all kinds of different projects. What is the problem with hiring consultants to assist us, to work alongside St. Lucians to ensure that we benefit from the best practices there are in healthcare. What is wrong with that? I don't understand it. So consultants are good for building roads. Consultants are good for building airports. Consultants are good for building bridges. But consultants are not good for ensuring we get the best quality healthcare. I don't understand it. This is what should be most important. Because trust me, if somebody has a broken leg, you want the best orthopedic surgeon to attend to the person. This is what every individual wants. Take an example. We have orthopedic surgeons here in St. Lucia. Of course we do. And I'm sure we have very good ones. But consider the orthopedic surgeon, say, in the United States of America, who does 1,000 knee replacements a year, or 3,000 a year. Think of the level of skill, expertise, and competence of that person. Just because he probably does 5 of these a day. We don't have the capacity to have that skill and expertise because we do not have the volume. It's not to say we're discriminating against St. Lucians. No, we recognize that expertise has been developed in certain sectors because there is the volume and people have done this so many times that we can benefit from their skill and knowledge. And that's why we're doing it. When consultants come to a country, they're not taking decisions. No, the government or the agency that employs them makes the decisions based on their recommendations. Members on the other side know this. And this is not a new practice in healthcare in St. Lucia. In 1997, when we revamped the A&E department, 1997, 1998, we went and got consultants. We went and got consultants to help advise us on the best way forward. If I remember clearly, we got persons from the Howard Medical Center in Miami. They came down here, worked alongside us. And that was how we were able to revamp the A&E. When we looked at mental health reform, we got Dr. Ordaz from Cuba, who had run an excellent psychiatric hospital over in Cuba. He came down here with his team and worked alongside us, training our persons, of course, benefiting and getting the local knowledge. But some things are standard in healthcare. They don't change. Procedures, practices, systems, the best way of doing things. Some of these things are standard within the profession. They don't change. But of course you take into account cultural and local context. So you bring in the best of both worlds, the international standards and the local knowledge. And that is how you are able to deliver a first-class service to your people. Why can't the people of St. Lucia have that? What is so difficult to understand about this? That's what I want to know. And Mr. Speaker, this is so for every discipline. You have radiology, you have neurology, you've got everything. That is why they are consultants and they are general practitioners. That was the mistake that was made with St. Jude Hospital in rebuilding the facility. That was a specialized and technical project, but technical and specialized help was not sought. It was an experiment that was conducted on the lab. That's why we are. I'm going back to the consultancies. He was the one who raised the issue of the consultancies, Mr. Speaker. He was the one who raised it. He spoke about consultancies, and I'm dealing with it. I'm giving an example.
Are you standing on the point of order, Mr.
Yes, that's the point of order.
Make the...
Because, Mr. Speaker, you ruled it a few minutes ago that I should not stray. And now she's extra straight.
Yeah, very well.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member took his time. He was not interrupted and he spoke about consultancy. As though he had a problem, as though he had such a serious problem with the government of St. Lucia finding some specialized persons who are well able, have run hospitals, top world-class hospitals, to help us run the OKU. What they do not want to see is that we will provide a first-class health service, and it will be provided under the government of the United States. That's what we are doing. The Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother. The Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother ran St. Jude Hospital from the time I was a child, the time I became a grown-up. What? That was outside management. But up to today, St. Jude, even though it's run from the stadium, still has better management practices than Victoria Hospital. Why? Because the structures, systems, and procedures were set in place, and St. Lucians continue to run it with those systems. The Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother left, the Sisters of Mercy came, and they've gone, St. Lucians, because we set down the systems and rules and procedures. You cannot simply take Victoria Hospital and drop it into OKEU. That's not how it works. A new culture, a new system, a new way of doing things. And that is what the transition is about. The consultants are coming to help us, not to tell us what to do, but to advise, to make recommendations, to help with training, to identify the best persons in St. Lucia within the healthcare service who can be trained for the best disciplines there are, so that we can continue to run the hospital. Because that's the point I just want to make. And I don't want to take this discussion further than where it has to go, but I do want to take the opportunity to ask, to thank the doctors, the nurses, the assistants, the ward maids, the porters, all of those people who work in our health system. They've had to work under very trying conditions, and they continue to do that. We want to reassure them that the government of St. Lucia is putting its best foot forward so that we can ensure that when they move over to the new facility, they do not have just the best environment in terms of physical structure to work with, but they also have the best administrative structure. They have the procedures so that they can give up their best. They can enjoy practicing and serving in a vocation that they have chosen. And so that at the end of the day, we will not just have healthy, happy, productive workers, but this energy will also be transmitted to the patients whom they serve. And so, Mr. Speaker, with that, I would like again to express my unwavering support for this bill, and I would ask that all of us work together to ensure that we can provide the best health care to the people of St. Lucia. I thank you.
Member for Swazel Saltibus.
Mr. Speaker, I rise very briefly to make some very brief comments on this bill, because I would like to save my energy for the next bill, which is going to be led by myself. But, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the bill as led by the Honorable Prime Minister, specifically to what this bill is meant to deal with today, and that is to preserve the pension of officers who would have to be transferred, or rather seconded to the Owen King institution. And that is really what the bill seeks to address, Mr. Speaker. And that is why I wish to support it wholeheartedly and 100%, Mr. Speaker. Because I came into office in 2016, Mr. Speaker, and the Millennium Heights Medical Complex bill was something that I found when I came into office. I think it was something that was in place from 2015, if I'm correct. And this amendment today seeks specifically to address, as the Prime Minister indicated, any inconsistencies, any ambiguity as relates to transferring an officer from the public service. So, well, as we rightfully correcting today, seconding an officer. So I am not sure where my friend from Denver North is leading as it relates to the privatization of the Owen King, and I think we should try as much as possible to speak to the context of which this bill is trying to address today, which is the preservation of pensions of anybody who will be seconded to the musician. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Keep it nice and tight. Come on, gentlemen. Keep it nice and tight.
Member for Castries Office.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that we are going to meet once again before the end of the year, so I can extend special greetings to my constituents and the people of St. Lucia, but in the event we don't, I would like to take this opportunity to do so. We are going into the holiday season very soon. I join my voice in welcoming our students from Sir Arthur Lewis Community College here this morning. And Mr. Speaker, I sat here wondering what was happening in the House this morning. Because one of the challenges that we've had with politicians, Mr. Speaker, is consistency. And when we are inconsistent in what we say, what we do, when we say it, because it depends on which side of the house we are sitting on, then that is what influences our thinking much more than a position, a conviction, or a belief. And Mr. Speaker, I can take my speech of 2015 when I was in opposition, and I can read this speech on the Millennium Heights Act that was introduced to this Parliament, and it would remain relevant. I am amazed, Mr. Speaker, at the members opposite today. Because what are we looking at, Mr. Speaker? We are looking at a simple amendment to correct something that is not possible and admitted by the very leader of the opposition. He said the daily paid workers can neither be transferred nor seconded. So I wonder how he would explain to me when he passed the act of 2015 that said that the workers would be either seconded or transferred. Mr. Speaker, you see, he said the established workers and the non-established workers. So then in 2015, when they were passing this piece of resolution, the daily paid workers or the non-established workers were not important because they are featured nowhere in the bill. Neither can they be transferred, nor can they be seconded. Did he give an explanation in the House, Mr. Speaker, for what would have happened to these workers? But all of a sudden, he wakes up this morning and he realizes that something is going to happen to these workers. And how absurd, Mr. Speaker, that the members opposite can come. I will come to what I said about it. I will come. And that is why this government is fixing what they did, Mr. Speaker. That is all this is about, you know. The amendment, Mr. Speaker. The amendment, you cannot transfer. How can you transfer a public officer to a private entity? So all of a sudden we made, what I'm hearing opposite, Mr. Speaker, is we made OKEU a private entity. So the act that was passed in 2015, who passed the act? Who was in government in 2015 when this act, and all we are doing is changing one definition in there. And the members opposite have forgotten what they did, because when they sit on this side of the house, Mr. Speaker, they get amnesia about government and what they did when they were in government. But you see, when you are not consistent and when you don't speak the truth about things, you forget what you said at some point and you give a different version. And that is exactly what is happening in the House today. So I will go to my speech and I will read. Mr. Speaker, I am quoting from my speech from Hansard. Mr. Speaker, I am concerned about this because I see this bill, but I do not see the overall health plan. Now, that is what I said in 2015. The same opposition who today wants to advise the government on what should happen in health, how it should happen in health, and how we should roll out the program. The member for Denry North, he was in the House. They debated in support of the bill. I raised questions. And as I said, I could read that speech from start to finish and it would be relevant. But I have chosen special parts of the bill just to highlight. I am not one of those who stand there and expect that share or not to be part of the shared cost. At the end of the day, I am not one who would stand and expect that government will pay all the medical bills. That was my statement in opposition, that we all knew that the cost of healthcare was not something that could be met entirely by government alone. That's a reality. I was not afraid to say it in opposition. What question did you ask?
Honorable member, continue, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I want to answer the member for Castries. The member for Castries is asked, can you second from government to a private entity? And I say categorically no. That is why we are here. You can second, no. You cannot transfer. You can second. You can second.
Honorable member, speak for the chair and continue your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will continue. But we would, listen to this, Mr. Speaker, but we would need to know, given the present situation that we are in, Mr. Speaker, where we stand. Because as members and representatives of constituencies, when I go back to my constituency and I walk in the area where there is somebody who is not well, not so well off financially, they will ask the question, this new system that you passed in the House, how is it going to impact me financially? And I challenge any member opposite, through you, Mr. Speaker, to show when once in this House they indicated to the people of St. Lucia what it would cost to run the new health facility. You had consultants. Did you ever come and tell the people of St. Lucia how you would fund the project? Mr. Speaker, I continue because I have tried to maintain consistency. When I'm in opposition, I don't sing a song because I want to get into government, and when I get into government, I forget it, like we see over there. So when we look at the structure, we have to be concerned about cost, because everything comes down to the cost at the end of the day. And because of this, I was hoping that we would have had a little more time to consult. You heard that? Today they want to lecture us about time to consult. But when we ask basic questions, basic, no answer. As Mr. James said, with the average people who will be affected by this new structure, I have very little information to speak to other than what is in the bill. What is new, Mr. Speaker? Their bill, you know, Mr. Speaker. They are the ones who are in government. They are the ones who passed the bill, and all we are making is a simple amendment to the bill to correct what they put in the bill that could not happen. How difficult is that for the average person to understand? If you cannot transfer a public servant from a government entity to a private entity, what are you required to do? You are required to second this worker. When you second a worker, you guarantee them their tenure of office. They are entitled to all of the benefits. And I remember asking, but I will come to it because the bill has it, Mr. Speaker, that the absolute authority to hire and to fire was that of the board. The board that they passed, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite, when they were in government, the board that they passed had the absolute authority to hire and to fire. Okay? So, and you know how we were able to appoint the chairman of the board? By the very legislation that you passed. And in my speech it is there. When you give politicians authority, they use it. So I raise the issue of SLASPA. It's in my speech. And I said the position of SLASPA is by designation. The permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance. The members opposite, including the leader of the opposition, and the former Prime Minister, member for Beaufort South, the member for Dennery North, and the member for Labrie, all four seated opposition today, was part of the government when they passed the bill. And I raised the concern, Mr. Speaker, the then Minister of Health from Babono. I said, why are we giving that authority to the minister to be the one to engage the chairman of the board, and the board has absolute authority to make the decision? I have very little information to speak about other than what's in the bill, because based on the presentation by the parliamentary representative for Babono, I was hoping to get explanations for a lot of things that may not have been contained in the bill as to why we are moving in this direction. So, Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that we will reconsider and maybe take a little more time, because the health service for every St. Lucian will be impacted. And that is why I am not going to deal with this thing from a political standpoint. I am going to deal with it purely on the basis of what I see and how it is going to impact us. You know how bad it was back then, Mr. Speaker? They have changed the bill. And they brought it to the House. And what I had to debate was still the old copy. I never got the new copy when we came to the debate. And the then member for Beaufort South said to me, well, nothing much has changed. So all my quotations in my speech was based on the old act, and the pages had changed. You see, Mr. Speaker? Yes, the numbering of the pages. The numbering of the pages. So when I quoted page 13, it may have appeared on page 14 in the new act. Because they came in to debate something in the House. They have the copy, but the members opposite did not have the revised copy. That is what happened. And it's in my speech. You see, Mr. Speaker, we can always, it's in Hansard. Only me remember that, because I'm consistent. The difference with you is you're not consistent. So you can't remember what you said. Mr. Speaker, I move on. Mr. Speaker, let's take section 4. Composition of the board. Remember, I'm quoting from my speech.
But
I'm quoting from my
honorable member, I'm not saying don't quote from your speech, but I do not want, like I tried earlier, to take it too far. So continue then.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I take section 4, composition of the board. Now, like Mr. James, I have to use the old one, because that is the one I have, that is what I have worked with. I heard the member for Beaufort South say that changes in the new one are minimal, so it does not really impact what is being discussed there. I told you it's in Hansard. I said, Mr. Speaker, it is there. It is in the record of St. Lucia. You think I was making up a story? If I go to section 4, and I am just looking for clarification, section 4 speaks about composition of the board. The board consists of no less than 8 persons and no more than 10 persons. And I made a form. I said if you wanted to say 9 members should make up the board, 9 members should make up the board. If you say not less than 8 and no more than 10, the only odd number between 8 and 10 is 9. So you could have just said the board is made up of 9 members. It's in my speech, Mr. Speaker. You see, but members opposite forget that you are not always in authority. So let me go to the more substantial matters of that bill that was passed. Because, Mr. Speaker, all we are trying to do is to correct an anomaly. Mr. Speaker, I move on to page 12. On page 12, it speaks about the various functions of the board. What the board shall do and what it shall not do. And I make particular reference to H. Employ, discipline, terminate staff as required. See what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker? So the board that they passed had the full authority to employ, to discipline, and to terminate staff. But today, you hear all kinds of allegations as if we were the ones who introduced some kind of bill that is going to impact the employees of Victoria Hospital and other persons in the health sector. Mr. Speaker, I just explained to the member for Castries East. I know he's a bit confused these days because he don't know if he's the leader or if he's not the leader, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, I just said H in the functions of the board in the Principal Act says they shall employ, discipline, and terminate. And he's still asking me, where is it? Mr. Speaker, he's still asking me where it is. It is in H of the principal act that you passed. That is where it is, in H. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was hoping that I would have some explanation in relation to the transition from the present structure of government employees through the public service and how this transition will be facilitated in the new structure. And that is what we are fixing here. Mr. Speaker, I asked them the question in 2015. They left office in June of 2016, and I challenge any one of them to show me anywhere they ever answered that question. Mr. Speaker, I will come to that because the section that speaks to it is still a bit confusing to me because it speaks about secondment and of other persons, but I will come to that as I go along. I am just raising the concern based on the responsibility of the board. And I want to know whether these persons being spoken about here are persons who are presently permanent employees of government of St. Lucia through the various sectors of the public service. That's why I tell you, Mr. Speaker, I can just read the speech. Don't pretend like you all have amnesia in the House. Mr. Speaker, we are the legislators. We cannot pass laws when we in government that we are afraid of when we are in opposition. There must be consistency in government. The laws that you pass today, you should not be afraid of it tomorrow. And so, Mr. Speaker, when the members come and try to make it look like we have some ulterior motive for privatizing OKEU, you are the one who put a statutory board that has already privatized it. We didn't need your help. We tried to advise you on it, but you didn't want to take our advice. Here's what I ask, Mr. Speaker. Are we going to terminate the employment of those persons and get them attached to the new institution as new employees? And will they be under the sole control of the board in terms of the employment status and whether they remain employed or not? Because remember, the point was that the board has the sole authority to employ, to hire, to fire. I ask these questions because I have these concerns. Now, Mr. Speaker, the real government of this country is in office. And the real government is fixing this problem by giving the guarantee to all the employees who are under the public service structure that their tenure of employment is guaranteed because they are going to be seconded, but all of their benefits are going to be protected. The board solely cannot fire them at will. The board may say, I will return, or I no longer need your services. You can go back to your main employer. You didn't answer it when I asked. Today you want to answer it? Mr. Speaker, I have not seen the transition plan. So today we are hearing the members saying that there was a transition plan, that a consultant had been hired, and that the government is discussed. I asked back in 2015, where is the transition plan from VH to OKEU? You know what the transition plan was, Mr. Speaker? A naming ceremony, where they spent over $100,000 to place a plaque on the hospital and fake advertisements, a calendar showing the MRI machine working, persons getting, and you know how much they paid for the calendars? Thousands of dollars, Mr. Speaker, for somebody to act as if they were getting an MRI, as if they were getting services, and people still have the calendars at their homes, Mr. Speaker. That is what we got from the opposition. A 649, Mr. Speaker. That is what they gave us for OKEU, and all of a sudden they have become experts on advising this government on how to handle healthcare. Mr. Speaker, I have concerns about what will happen to the workers and how the transition will be facilitated. Who is going to be responsible and what is the arrangement? Because if the board is fully responsible for the complex, I also need to ask, will the size of the Ministry of Health be reduced? These were legitimate concerns back then. Because there was no plan. They never had a plan. Because they are not successful in anything that they do, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to take my whole time and read this whole speech. But I think, Mr. Speaker, I will request of one of the papers, or I will put that speech online, that anybody can go and read my contribution towards the debate in 2015, when the members opposite tried to put wool over the eyes of the people of St. Lucia into making them believe that OKEU was ready. And it is this government that have not opened the hospital. Mr. Speaker, if you cannot transfer workers, as the member, I could not believe the member for Castries East and leader of the opposition was saying that the workers can neither be transferred, that's the temporary workers, neither be transferred nor seconded. And he still sat in the parliament and passed a bill that the only two provisions made there was transfer and second. And today he is asking me what to do with the workers. I can assure you, the workers will be well taken care of under this government. There's going to be an increase in employment, not a decrease in employment at OKEU. So when the transition is fully made, and then they attack the issue of a consultant. But I am happy that the member for Castries Central was able to answer them. Because then again, they were in government, Mr. Speaker. They hired consultants. It was okay for them to hire consultants. But once it is the United Workers' Party government that employ consultants, it's a crime. Mr. Speaker, if they want me to tell them about consultants, I can tell them about these. I can tell them about all the consultants that they hired. But Mr. Speaker, the issue of healthcare is more important than our political bickerings. Because some people are power hungry to do what they cannot do. So they try to use health. No, not only me. There's a team. You see, Mr. Speaker, we have a team of capable men and women. And the task has been difficult. Being able to move into OKEU has been a challenge because there was no plan, there was no financing. So I want to ask the member for Viewfort South. I know he will speak after me. So I want to ask him, Mr. Speaker. I know that I'm the fuel that burns in your combustion. So,
Honorable member.
Mr. Speaker, when this piece of legislation was passed, didn't the members opposite understand, and spearheaded by the member for Beaufort South, that they could not transfer the public servants? And I want them to tell me what is wrong with the amendment that is being proposed, because the amendment is simple. Recognizing that there was also an instance where personnel may have to be retained or transitioned from the public service to take up duty at the medical complex, provision was also made for the transfer or secondment of a public officer or the service of the board. Yes. The service of the board and the preservation of the officer's position. However, Mr. Speaker, here's the point. However, based on the Pensions Act, the use of the word transfer considers the movement of a public officer from one department or ministry to another within the structure of the public service. And what was done with the Millennium Heights Act in putting the OKEU, the Wellness Center, and the Turning Point under a single entity, which is a statutory structure that it's quasi-government. It's not officially government. So, Mr. Speaker, all we are doing is making the corrections. And I have heard all kinds of insinuations by members opposite. Is because we want to privatize the hospital, so we are setting a platform to be able to do so. Mr. Speaker, they are the ones who passed the act. Additionally, the act also makes general reference to who has the power to second a public service to the service of the board of the Millennium Heights. In order to cure, this is what I'm saying, in order to cure the inconsistency or the ambiguity which arises from the aforementioned, the bill therefore seeks to amend the act by firstly deleting any reference to transfer of a public officer. That is all we are attempting to do. The act makes reference to transfer of a public officer, which is contrary to what is established in the Pensions Act. So the bright lawyers on the other side, Mr. Speaker, who always want to tell us what to do when we pass in a piece of legislation, they cannot advise themselves. They have to hire lawyers from Dominica to defend them. But you see, Mr. Speaker, they want to tell us that we cannot hire consultants. I don't need lawyers to defend me. I don't need lawyers to defend me yet. I don't need them to defend me yet.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
So, Mr. Speaker, I will repeat what I said there for the benefit of the member for Castries East, who keeps on asking me, what are you doing? In order to cure the inconsistency and ambiguity which arises from the aforementioned, the bill therefore seeks to amend the act by firstly deleting any reference to the transfer of a public officer to the Millennium Heights Medical Complex, and also to make reference to the secondment of the public officer. So we are doing two things. There are places in the act where it speaks about transfer of a public officer, which is inconsistent with the law. So we are correcting that. And where that occurs, you would be dealing with it from the standpoint that all of these public officers would be seconded. I don't know what language. I have to speak again for the member for Castries East to understand what I have said there. Secondly, the bill seeks to make clear which entity has the power to second a public officer to the service of the board of the Millennium Heights complex, namely the Public Service Commission, the Teaching Service Commission, or the Judicial and Legal Services Commission, as the case may be. Mr. Speaker, I rest my case. It is very clear that this government is the one making the right decision by fixing what needed to be fixed so that all public officers, nurses, whoever they are, who are employed by the public service in St. Lucia, that their tenure is well covered and well protected under the structure of the Millennium Heights Medical Complex. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Vieux-Fort South.
Speaker.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by all appearances, this appears as a very innocuous amendment. Very simple, very innocuous. But sometimes, as we know, very simple things portends great complexity and great difficulty. I did, Mr. Speaker, listen to the explanation of the member for Miku South, and to be honest with you, I left very confused. But I guess too with age I get a little more confused more often these days. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the member for Miku South was cautious. While it is true I did not understand his gobbledygook, what he was trying to say, he nevertheless proceeded to suggest that if defects arise, there is always the option of returning to the House and to amend. Now, to some extent, I sympathize and understand, because it is difficult that on this side of the House, there are no lawyers sometimes to take us through the various provisions, and well-intentioned comments are discarded with ease. Now, practicing lawyers, I might want to want tempted to say, but leave this flood alone. Right. Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, you know, there is a section in our Constitution, and I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at it, Mr. Speaker, Section 33, which does make the Attorney General, who is a public officer, to be a member of the House. It says, at any time when the office of Attorney General is a public office, as is the case now, the Attorney General shall, by virtue of holding or acting in that office, be a member of the House. And of course, former governments are just as guilty, because we have had Attorney Generals who have been public officers, and we have not made them members of the House, partly because of their own shyness, that they don't want to meet the cut and thrust of the debate. But given the disabilities of the government, it might well make sense for the government to invoke Section 33 and invite the Attorney General to be a member of the House, so that when these debates arise, now what is a member for Castries South East, Mr. Speaker? Could you ask him why is he laughing? Could you ask him to clarify why he's laughing? I have just commenced my address, yes. I said disability. No, to cure the disability. Oh, well, I meant no offense, absolutely. But maybe that could help to resolve and allow for some exchange and don't place the government at the mercy of the member for Castries Southeast. Mr. Speaker, it is erroneous, plainly erroneous to say that the legislation introduced by the former government did not provide security of tenure to those employees who will be transferred from medical institutions to the OKU. That is just false. I draw your attention, Mr. Speaker, to section 34.3. It says in the plainest language possible, where transfer or secondment referred to in subsection 2 is effective, the rights of the public officer so transferred or seconded to any pension, gratuity, or other allowance for which he or she would have been eligible had he or she remained in the public service are preserved. How then can you stand up in this house and say that they had no security of tenure? The language is elusively clear, very, very clear. The question that arises now is whether we achieve that security of tenure better by this amendment to remove the word transfer and to use the word secondment. That's the issue. That is a fundamental issue. Now, Mr. Speaker, what does secondment mean in ordinary language? What does it mean? What is the dictionary meaning of the word secondment? Secondment means a person's reassignment from his or her regular employment to some temporary assignment elsewhere. That's what secondment means. And in the public service, when we have used the term secondment, we have always meant, we have always understood it means reassignment to some other position, but for a temporary basis, for a period, a specified period of time, renewable or otherwise. Now, the amendment uses the word secondment. It removes the word transfer, speaks of secondment, but of course chose not to define secondment. Of course, law can say anything. Even can say what is foolish, as you know. I mean, you could have had a definition of secondment to mean something else. But the reality is that if you are using the word secondment, then you're importing the ordinary meaning of the word secondment, unless of course you ascribe some other meaning. The question I think that the member for Swazelle really should have put, and I invite him to reflect on it, is there more or greater security of tenure when nurses are transferred or seconded? That's the question. Is there more security of tenure when the staff of Victoria Hospital and Allied Health Services are transferred as against secondment? That's a fundamental question. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is well known, Mr. Speaker, that the model that the former government used to deal with the staffing of the OKU was in fact the precise model, or almost precise model, maybe with some variation, that was used at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. When persons who were public officers in education were transferred to the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, there was a similar provision in the Act that sought to protect the security of tenure of those individuals at Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. There's no issue of privatization of Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. It was remain a government institution. But that was the logic, that was the history, that was the pattern, that was the, shall we say, the precedent that we utilized. Subject, of course, to other more recent pronouncements on the courts regarding what transfer meant. Mr. Speaker, I think we need to be very careful what we are doing. And I want just for a moment to go back to the Constitution of the country and to the powers of the Public Service Commission. Since in either case, if you're talking about secondment, it appears that you have to be relying on the Public Service Commission. If you're talking about transfer, you're dealing with the same thing. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, the relevant provision of the Constitution is Section 86. And a similar provision exists in respect of the Teaching Service Commission, but it's not material here. Mr. Speaker, it says, the power to appoint persons to hold or to act in offices in the public service, including the power to confirm appointments, and subject to the provisions of Section 96 of this Constitution, the power to exercise disciplinary control over persons holding or acting in such offices, and the power to remove such persons from office shall vest in the Public Service Commission. That's what it says. Now, curiously, Mr. Speaker, the section I just quoted makes no reference to the power of the Commission to transfer. But it has been accepted that you can appoint a public officer from one post to the other on transfer. So the clear suggestion has always been that the power to transfer, though it is not mentioned in the provision, is implicit in the power to appoint. That has always been a fundamental point. You don't see any reference, any power to a power of secondment. Unless you're now prepared to say that if you argue that there's a power of transfer, then automatically you must also argue that there's a power of secondment. That it is also implied, significantly implied. But then, if that is so, understand that the notion that you can second for a temporary period, then that notion has to be revisited. Now, to the credit of the draftsman of this bill, and I concede this, the draftsperson of the bill says that the person would be, shall we say, seconded on the written consent. In other words, if, as we suggest, that secondment is for a specified time, then what a nurse, a doctor, or health practitioner is doing, saying that I am consenting to leave my post as a public officer, protected by the Public Service Commission, I'm going to go across to OKEU, but only for a specified time, and I'm agreeing to do this. But does the person still remain under the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission is a fundamental question. Do they remain under the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission? It is because we were aware of these differences. Differences of transfer, differences of appointment on secondment, that we use the two terms transfer or seconded. So in effect, what we were doing was to give the public servants far greater security of tenure. And that is why I think you then have to ask yourself whether a public servant who is appointed by a Public Service Commission has greater security of tenure by virtue of being seconded. What are the implications? Now, Mr. Speaker, I had a member for Miku South saying, well, you know, we had to do this because of the Pensions Act. The Pensions Act is ordinary legislation, you know. Some people behave as if the Pensions Act can't be touched, that you can't amend the Pensions Act. If, therefore, you had a problem with the Pensions Act, to ensure that you give the nurses and doctors and others the security they need, amend the Pensions Act. Leave this alone. What are you interfering with that for? Why you need to interfere with it is a question. Now, sometimes the exchanges between parliamentarians often help because they clarify objectives and purposes. The member for Castries East, the leader of the opposition, and to some extent the member for Denry North, challenges the member for Castries Southeast and says, well, you want to use the term secondment to better facilitate privatization of the OKE. Now, he admits that. He says so. He accuses us of saying it, attacks us for saying it, spreading all kind of propaganda, but in the end he says, well, that is to facilitate that. Mr. Speaker, if I'm misleading you out, you know, I think it's drawing. But I know you're listening to him as you're now listening to me. So that is his point, that is his thrust. So where has, therefore, the leader of the opposition caused any unnecessary mischief in his presentation? Now, Mr. Speaker, it is the case that this House does not take any advice regarding legislation from the opposition. And I suspect that it has to remain like that for some time until something happens along the way, and then you have to come back to the House to seek redress. Now, I couldn't believe what I was hearing this morning from the member for Castries Southeast. He's a seasoned parliamentarian of great dexterity, shall we say. He's a seasoned parliamentarian of, I couldn't find a more neutral word. That's not the word I want to use, you know. But for purposes of the House, and not to antagonize the Speaker this morning, because I see he's trying to rein in what he hasn't done in the past, he's doing today, rein in the debate to keep it on a straight line. And I applaud him, I support him. So I will retain the word dexterity. Now, the member has the audacity to stand in this House and say, when the former government passed the Millennium Heights medical complex, what you did was in effect privatized. No, Mr. Speaker, that's absurd. And the absurdity is reflected when he says later in his presentation, but what you did was statutorize. It is perfectly the case, Mr. Speaker, that I'm rather amused by that. Thank God, some people have more than one. You see, thank God people have more than one. Now you see where he goes, and you're quiet.
I'm just trying to get agreement for Professor News.
But in time. But that having been said, Mr. Speaker, let me say that there is no argument to sustain the point that you are privatizing the Millennium Medical Heights complex. The statutory board mechanism has always been used by governments to express their legal personality. In fact, Mr. Speaker, there are occasions when a government may decide not to go by way of statutorization and establish a company which it owns to manage its business and take on the clothing of a private sector entity or a corporate entity, as the case may be. And there are several. But this can never ever be said not to be a statutory entity, a government entity. And in fact, the whole objective, Mr. Speaker, of Section 34(3) is that when the nurses, doctors, and other health practitioners are transferred to the OKEU, although they are under the direction and employment of a board, but in terms of the powers of discipline, dismissal, and pension, they cannot interfere with those transferred officers. That has to be handled differently. And why you did that? For the very simple reason of trying to avoid the complex constitutional issues that will rise over security of tenure. Now, the member draws attention to clause 34. And this is what it says. Subject to subsections 2 and 3, an employee of the board other than an employee under the subsections 2 and 3 shall be employed by the board on a contractual basis. To distinguish between the new employees, the new doctors, the new nurses, the new technicians, the board was given the power to employ these persons, but employ them by way of a contract. This clearly is distinguishable from those officers who in fact have been transferred from allied institutions, and I'm referring to Victoria Hospital, Turning Point, and the rest of it. Mr. Speaker, question is, where does this leave us at this stage? Where is it? It's a complex issue. I'm the first to admit it is a complex issue. But I believe that this is not the approach that should be taken. And unless we can get the legal clarity we need as to what secondment means in this context, what flows from it, I would urge that some caution be exercised. Now, there's nothing to prevent a nurse at Victoria Hospital saying, listen, I don't want to face all this tralala of being transferred from Victoria Hospital to OKU. I prefer it differently. I could resign, I could retire, but then I will prefer to be employed by contract. These are the things that we have to look at. And so I really believe that this will end up, as it is, causing more problems than it resolves issues. Now, Mr. Speaker, if that was not the case, why on earth should the Public Service Commission be involved in secondment? Why? Because it is an admission of the powers of protection that a Public Service Commission has over a public officer which it has appointed on a pensionable basis. And this, in my view, is denuding, stripping the public officer of all the protection that that public officer enjoys. Of course, you can all go ahead. The majority speaks. The majority could proceed, as has happened in other cases. We can do that. And then, of course, the consequences come later on in due course. But you hear in these debates all kinds of things. And the time, I'm sure, will come when there will be a big debate on St. Jude Hospital in this House. It must come. But, you know, we owe it to those people who are involved in the construction and the management of St. Jude to speak the truth. No matter, Mr. Speaker, whether we don't like the job that they did, and the curious thing for me has always been the fact that all the consultants at St. Jude's were consultants appointed by them, you know, which the former government met, every one of them. All the consultants were appointed by the former government. But to suggest, as I heard this morning, that we proceeded to reconstruct St. Jude without consultants and advice is not true. Accreditation, wish to, on a point of order?
Yes,
of course I will give way to you.
Well,
Anytime.
Very well, member.
First, Mr. Speaker, I would like to seek clarification from the honourable member as to whether the statements he's making, is he attributing it to my comments? I'd like to know that to begin with, Mr. Speaker, if he may be kind enough to provide me with this information.
Mr. Speaker, I refer to comments made in this House earlier, which stated that when the former government, was engaged in the construction of St. Jude, we never got proper advice from consultants. Correct, Mr. Speaker? You heard that, didn't you? All right. Now, all I'm saying is that that is inaccurate. That is inaccurate because the then government utilized the services of Accreditation Canada to advise it on the hospital, the design of the internal structures of the hospital, and so too did the Millennium Heights. Now, we can sit in this House and denounce whatever they provided, but in time the debate will come. The debate must come. But at least concede what the truth is in these matters. So, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, I don't buy the explanation provided by the member from Eagle South. It doesn't help. I believe that this has placed these civil servants in a far more vulnerable position. And very clearly, I would urge that if any amendments are to be made, that the language should be as in the Act, transfer or secondment, as the case may be, with a possible definition of what you mean by secondment. Mr. Speaker, I regret. It doesn't matter though. I can't lend my support to this bill. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. But I think this bill is defective. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Viewport South, can you?
Thank you.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to close the debate on this issue. You know, it's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, that we've reached a tenure in our political history in which there's such a
Honorable
sinister...
Prime Minister, let's permit the students and teachers or lecturers of this students college to vacate. You may proceed, Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me just start from the onset to indicate publicly, clearly, and hopefully for the last time, which I doubt will be the case, that there is no intentions on my government's part to privatize OKE. And there never has been. So hopefully, again, I'm on record. I make it publicly known clearly that there is no intentions to be able to privatize OKE. Okay? So this sinister perspective, Mr. Speaker, by members of the opposite side, to look at something that is a simple issue, to dig deep further, to believe there's some alternative motive other than simply protecting the workers of St. Lucia, I have to say to you, is farcical. And to watch members on the other side, especially experienced members, to try to defend the indefensible, rather than to accept with humility that a mistake was made. We all make those mistakes. That's why I said it in my preamble. We're not any one of us perfect, and I gave them the benefit of the doubt that these were done with the best of intentions. We heard the member from Viewport South try his best to justify making no amendments. And with the greatest amount of difficulty, and I have to say that he failed in being able to define the difference between transfer and secondment. So the understanding of my side with regards to transfer is an act that can take place with a public servant within the government. So I can transfer somebody from commerce to tourism. I can transfer somebody from infrastructure to economic development. And so a transfer applies to within the government service. But you cannot transfer a public servant outside of the public service. And the member from Beaufort South also correctly indicated, how can you be a servant of two masters? The purpose of being seconded is simply in order to be able to preserve your pension. Now, the member from Beaufort South maybe ought to listen to himself sometimes and try out before he says these things publicly. So the fact that he is suggesting that the solution to this problem was to amend the Pensions Act and to leave this one alone. So which one was there first? Was the Pensions Act there first, or the Millennium Heights Act first? So therefore, if you now have a Pensions Act in existence and it has certain definitions, why wouldn't you draft the legislation to be consistent with the Pensions Act? And the Pensions Act accepts the ability to second members of the public service outside, and that when you do that in seconding them, that their pension is preserved. That is what we are trying to cure here. In the explanatory notes, Clause 4 of the bill amends the same section the member from the Leader of the Opposition wants to understand. His answer is here. Don't have to get it from anybody else. It's right here. Okay? So it says what? Section 34 of the Act, transfer of a service and preservation of a pension rights. To delete references to the transfer of a public officer and to only make reference to the secondment of a public officer. Clause 4 of the bill also provides for a public officer to agree in writing to a secondment. Nothing sinister. The two terms are used that are not mutually exclusive, inclusive. They are mutually exclusive. They make reference to different things, and all we're attempting to do here is to cure that. But you know, members on the other side, Mr. Speaker, despite you trying to advise them, broaden the debate to determine where's the money coming from, how are things going to work out. So, Mr. Speaker, let me take them through what my government's policy is, which is very different to what their policy was. So, in fact, Mr. Speaker, members on the opposite side continue to talk about the importance of healthcare, but their actions did not support that. We've seen, in the case of St. Jude's, they had 5 years. What excuse can anybody offer, Mr. Speaker? What excuse can anyone offer for not having the hospital built? Was it the absence of spending money? We know that that's not the case. The fact is, we know that they spent over $130 million. We know that they never had planning approval. We know that they never had proper certification. So all these years have gone by, Mr. Speaker, and they were not able to solve it. Moving into OKU. How is it? What's the justification? Where was the excuse? Why did that not happen? And even in opposition, what we said was, at minimum, move the dialysis lab from Victoria into OKU. Those members on the opposite side who actually go to Victoria and actually had gone to see where the dialysis lab was, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the old nurses' quarters, a building that the Ministry of Infrastructure had actually condemned. And that's where it was. You would go in there, and there was just wires hanging out. You could see that it's a building that was just standing out of mere habit. That we now know historically that the only thing that was missing to have opened the dialysis center at OKU, because all the pipework had been done, all the mechanics were there, all that was missing were the chairs to be able to plug in. And in fact, we now know that if they wanted, there was 8 chairs available in a container in Viewport that was waiting for the dialysis center at St. Jude's, which they knew they were not even close to being able to open up. And even when this government came in and made it attempt from the get-go to be able to move the dialysis center into the facility, they were on the bandwagon that we needed to have the hospital operational before we could do that. Not knowing around the world, there are several facilities around the world in which you have dialysis centers as standalone facilities. And we had to push and push and push, all the time remembering the people who were currently being serviced at Victoria, to persevere to be able to make that happen. And look at that. It's up and operating. No problems. None. In opposition, we clearly identified that we knew what the problem was, Mr. Speaker. The problem with moving into OKU was money. And the members on the opposite side would be familiar with the University of West Indies report that was done, which said that it would cost about $70 million to be able to operate OKU. Now, most of us, hopefully, have some level of common sense that when you know that Victoria Hospital costs $35 million to operate, and I don't think there's any one of us who's going to defend Victoria Hospital as being a facility of excellence. So it means that there are a great number of deficiencies that exist at Victoria. And that's $35 million. So we're now going to move into a modern facility, air-conditioned, high-tech equipment, much greater maintenance requirements, with less beds. So the efficiency of the operation is going to have to be greater. Do we believe that that number of $70 million is misquoted? In fact, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's understated. I think it's going to be more. So already, healthcare cost us $110 million, of which close to 85% of that $110 million is staffing. So if you now add 35 million or 40 million, because the assumption, Mr. Speaker, all along has been that we're going to shut Victoria. That's the assumption. So the $35 million it costs to operate OKEU is now going to be transferred from Victoria to OKEU, and therefore the government has to find another $35 or $40 million. What was the former government's allocation? $10 million. That's what they gave the Ministry of Health. They said, we're going to give you $10 million to move into OKU, and you have to make it work. How is that possible? How is that possible? And yet there are lots of reports, lots of consultants would show that that's impossible to happen. So the question, Mr. Speaker, is where is this money going to come from? And when we came into government, we did employ and bring in Dr. King and a group of people in order to make that determination. How are we going to transition? Do I believe that there is, for the most part, good capability in St. Lucia? I do. From a a medical perspective. But where there is a problem is in the management. The operating procedures, the organizational structure, the job descriptions, the management currently at Victoria is sorely lacking. One just has to walk through and see how many basic practices are not in existence. A person writing a software system on DOS to deal with a blood bank. Old equipment, when you go into the lab, half of the equipment in the lab is delinquent. They call it the museum, Mr. Speaker. Don't even have the capacity to get rid of all the stuff. Old air conditioners next to new air conditioners. Demolition work that's done and the stone work is still there. I mean, I happened to go up there the other day to walk through the wards, and even to my own chagrin. A simple thing like Wi-Fi, not in existence. And I'm grateful to Digicel for moving very quickly at our request and putting Wi-Fi in the facility. But how could it be that we knew that we were having problems in moving to OKU and that Victoria continues to operate in its current defective operations? And how are we going to change that? So Dr. King and his group came up with the idea, a very good idea, to increase the NIC contribution, which is currently at 10%, Mr. Speaker, and to increase it by 50% to 15%. So that means that the workers, instead of contributing 5% of their salary to NIC, now would be contributing 7.5% of their money to NIC. And businesses, instead of contributing 5%, they too would also now contribute 7.5%. And after my government looked at that, the issue that my government had with that is that while it would generate the $40 million, is that whoever could not afford health care today still would not be able to afford it tomorrow. That was the problem. And we believe that there are thousands, in excess of 40,000 people in this country who don't have access to health care. Basically can't afford to go to the doctor, and if they went to the doctor, can't afford a prescription. And that's why successive governments have given the amnesty with regards to people who owed money at Victoria and at St. Jude's. So we did not believe that that was going to be the solution to the problem. So what my government has decided is that we're going to introduce a national health care insurance program. Now, I'm not even going to go down the road of quoting the members on the opposite side's manifesto, where they too talked about a universal health insurance. They too, Mr. Speaker, talked about public-private partnership. I have no idea what that means. They didn't offer any further definition to that. And sadly for them, the public of St. Lucia did not give them the opportunity to be in government to expand upon that idea. But clearly the concept of a public sector, private sector partnership was in their manifesto. So what we decided to do is to have a national health care insurance. And in order to make that national health care insurance affordable, Mr. Speaker, and this is where the public sector, private sector partnership comes in, is that the government will pay for the salaries of the nurses and the doctors, the administration staff. We'll also pay for the cost of utilities, and we will be in charge and responsible for any capital and investments into healthcare. And the expectation is that the premium that will now be compulsory for every solution to participate in will pay for private doctor visits, prescriptions, and basic medical procedures to be defined. And what we've said is that persons who are earning a pension below a certain amount, because those people don't have the capability of augmenting their salary and should not be excluded. the government will pay their contribution for them. Those people who are on the poverty list, and that poverty list now needs to be expanded to represent everybody who is poor. Because the poverty list that we have is based on how much money we have, not by the need. And so the politics of it is continuously people wondering why I'm not on the list. And it's because we've been running successive deficits. Government doesn't have the capacity to put all that money in. But we need to expand that list to include and to identify all the people that should be on that list. And government will pay for their contribution to the insurance. And if you're unemployed and your income was below a certain level, we will pay 100%. If you were unemployed and your salary is higher, we will portion of it for a period of time. But everybody else who's employed will be required to make a contribution. Why do we want to do that? Because we know that government is good at recurrent expenditure. We're good at paying salaries. We also know, Mr. Speaker, that if we can get everybody on an insurance plan, and now those thousands of people who don't have access to health care actually go to the doctor and get checked up, and then statistically now, Mr. Speaker, we have all the information that we require to determine what I say is the health of our nation. How many people really are high blood pressure? How many people are pre-diabetic? How many people are advanced stages of being a diabetic? And we will now know that number. So it means that the programs that the Ministry of Health will be engaged in towards helping change people's lifestyles. We also know that there are too many solutions who are already pre-diabetic or borderline high blood pressure, who are not going to the doctor. Simple tablets can help remedy and letting them know that they need to change their lifestyle, and would prevent them from becoming on dialysis or prevent them from getting a stroke. Or how many people have had to go through amputations? These are the things that we want to be able to prevent. Because in the rhetoric, everybody talks about the same thing. We all know that the long-term solution to healthcare, Mr. Speaker, is by changing people's habits. It's a lifestyle. Now, how does this system start working? If in fact now we're able to have a successful program, why? Because we can measure it. We know how many people were pre-diabetic. We know what the programs we're putting in. And within months, we can start seeing the results of those programs. If now all of a sudden the number of people who are going to dialysis starts going down, the number of people who are having to be amputated goes down, the number of people who are having not to go to work because of high blood pressure or feeling exhausted, and we're able to start solving those problems, we now start reducing the risk of healthcare in our country. And as a result of it, your insurance premiums will either come down, or the quantum of services that we're going to be able to provide will grow. Now, in working with the World Bank and the IMF, and I want to thank the staff of the World Bank for their incredible assistance in this area, we wanted to make sure that whatever solution that we were bringing in, that we had the possibility of rolling it out within the OECS. Because imagine if we could get 180,000 people participating in our healthcare insurance program, and if that number now was expanded to 750,000, the levels of services that you're going to be able to get and the premiums that we're going to have to pay would come down considerably. So this is why we've chosen to implement the healthcare insurance through NIC. So NIC would be responsible for administering this basic healthcare insurance program. Why? Because there is a syndicate in the OECS of the NICs. They already work collaboratively together. So we have an opportunity of creating something that would be easily rolled out. Now, what we have to be mindful of is that we do not displace and compete against the private sector. So in providing this basic program that covers your doctor's appointments, getting your prescriptions, and as I said to you, basic surgeries, that you now have the opportunity to top that up with private sector. And government now has to figure out for the more vulnerable people in our society what we're going to do in order to help those people top up their support. So whether it's a self-imposed insurance plan, and as the need comes up, we help facilitate those people. Whether we take out a separate tertiary level insurance for them, that has to be determined. But the most important thing right now is to get every single solution a healthcare insurance card. That they know they can go to the doctor. They don't have to go to a politician. They don't have to go and beg their loved ones. That they have the responsibility themselves to go to that doctor. Because ultimately, I don't think there's anybody in this room that can say that we have to solve that problem. But Mr. Speaker, this idea that OKEU or St. Jude's by themselves is going to solve the problem, it's not. You can have the fanciest hospital, but if people can't afford to go, they're not going to go. And all is lost. So let's talk now about the consultancy, Mr. Speaker. We've realized that when we've gone through Victoria and also St. Jude's, I'd like to say, Mr. Speaker, that this is not the first time that I have said this, that the operating procedures that exist are archaic and ineffective and inefficient. And I don't blame the staff. Blame the fact that they have not stayed up with modern times. In fact, the better of the two operating systems in solution, Mr. Speaker, clearly is St. Jude's. And when you go there, you can see that the systems function. Where the files are, the prescriptions, the billing. Simply, people who are currently insured. When you go to St. Jude's collects that insurance money. Victoria is not doing that. These are people who have already paid insurance. And the insurance companies are prepared to pay. So what we need to do is to make sure that when we're transferring into OKEU, that we have an operating procedure that is going to allow it to be efficient. We have met with Canadians. We met with our very good friends in Martinique and Guadeloupe. We met with Cubans. We met with Colombians. And also we met with Cayman Health City, who have an operation in Cayman. And after all the considerations, we decided that we felt that the operating system that the Indians have is far much more efficient and much more relevant to us. Because the Indians now have become accustomed and have become world-class leaders, Mr. Speaker, in providing quality healthcare services at a very reasonable price. And the way that they've done that is by sharing services, by purchasing more medicine together. And exactly what the minister, the member from Castries Central talked about, is recognizing that they're doing thousands of operations and are developing the level of expertise. And it's how to share that expertise on a rotation basis. So a doctor would go and stay at a hospital that has a lot of patients and then move to a hospital that has less. But everybody starts benefiting now from that level of expertise. And also through technology, Mr. Speaker, if you do a blood test, if you do an MRI, it's automatically digitized, it's sent to a base in India, processed, and then sent back. And so there's a lot of economies of scale that have been established. So we have contracted this company, Cayman Health City, to come in, a 2-year contract, to assist, one, in designing a operating system for OKEU. So what's the organizational chart going to look like? What are the job descriptions going to be? And also to develop the operating procedures on a daily basis to raise the level of what we have. And we have a transition team of solutions. And that part of that is going to be that we're going to now, once the organizational chart is done, the job descriptions are done, the solutions will work side by side, overseen by the board, to help now interview the people and put them in their rightful place. And we know in advance, Mr. Speaker, that there's going to be shortcomings. We know that some people going into some basic jobs are going to require short-term training. We know that there are going to be people who are going to need medium-term training. And we know that there's some areas in which currently solutions cannot fill, but we want them to be filled. And so therefore we have to have a longer-term approach in getting scholarships and identifying those specific areas where we want to get solutions trained. But the goal of this administration is to make sure, as best as possible, that everybody who's going to be working at OKU will be solution. And the intention is to make sure that the board will be of solution vested interest. And the job of the board is to take these new ideas and to make sure that these ideas are now brought in and become solution. And take the best practices in solution, the best practices of what we're trying to learn, in order to deliver truly quality, affordable health care to all solutions. So, Mr. Speaker, I've taken this time to go into this detail. And hopefully I can dismiss in the idea of the members on the opposite side that there's anything sinister on our side in order to amend an act simply to be able to protect the rights of the workers of St. Lucia. That's all it is. And that we're committed to having a St. Lucia-grown solution and benefiting from the greatest amount of expertise that we can blend with our St. Lucian experience in order to provide this important service. And this is why we've said, Mr. Speaker, the fact that OKEU is going to have less beds, that there was an assumption that was even written into the policy that was overseen by the former government, that you had to now build up your primary health care services. We came here this morning to pass an OECS bill for $6 million. We've also borrowed $20 million from CDB, and not CDB, from the World Bank, US, and we've also been able to be beneficiaries of PAHO's smart centers, where you've now seen an unprecedented amount of investment in our primary health services. Why? That we want the first place that solutions go to is to their healthcare center. And the healthcare center needs to be the nerve center in terms of educating solutions about living a better lifestyle. But these are not things that you can put on a paper, Mr. Speaker. These are things that can only be measured by workers. And that is the difference on this side. That we are accustomed to delivering on what we have to do, spending less time on the propaganda and the politics and the blame game, and truly dealing with the urgency of healthcare, the urgency in education, the urgency in security in this country. And not last, but the urgency of infrastructure. Because without that, we cannot grow this economy. So again, Mr. Speaker, I want to dismiss any notion on the other side that there's anything sinister. I want to repeat, there's no intention by my government to privatize the OKEU, but the consultancy is simply to strengthen our own local work base. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, in order to protect the rights of the workers, we must take away the word transfer. It does not apply in this case, and we must make sure that they're all seconded. And when they are seconded, they are the responsibility of the Millennium Heights. If anything happens, they come back to the public service. That's the purpose of the secondment, as well as protecting their pension. So I thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members, the question is that the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment Bill be read a second time. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of the contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have
An act to amend the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Act number 1 of 2015.
Honorable members, clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill. Clause 3.
Amendment of section 2.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill. Clause 4.
Amendment of section 34.
Clause 4 stands part of the bill. Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the committee be adopted and the bill be read a third time and passed.
Honorable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment Bill be read a third time and passed. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia and by the authority of the same as follows. This act may be cited as the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment Act 2019.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg that the House be suspended for 1 hour for lunch.
Honorable members, the question is that the House stands suspended for the next hour. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. House is suspended.
And there you have it. We've come to the end of the morning session of Parliament for today, Tuesday, November 26, 2019. This morning we heard from members on both sides of the House where the Prime Minister delivered a motion, two motions, one of which was the OECS Regional Health project, where both sides of the House were all for the motion. We also heard the bill, the Millennium Heights Medical Complex Amendment Bill, where there was heated discussion on both sides pertaining to that bill. The House has been suspended for 1 hour for lunch and will resume.